At dawn in Kuala Lumpur, the world changed quietly but permanently. Cameras caught Mark Carney standing beside his aircraft, calm as ever after the ASEAN Summit. To most, it looked like another polite farewell. But behind that soft smile was a diplomatic earthquake. Because in those 4 days, Canada, yes, Canada, quietly broke away from America's orbit and redrew its place in the world. For decades, the US dictated the rhythm of North American trade. Canada followed the tune, but not anymore. In Malaysia, Carney didn't just attend meetings, he built a new foundation for the future. He spoke of clean energy corridors, AI partnerships, and a green economy that connects Canada directly to Asia's booming markets, completely bypassing Washington's control. And the best part? It caught the White House completely off guard. Trump's team wasn't expecting it, and what followed left Washington furious. This wasn't a headline moment, it was a historic pivot quietly unfolding in the East. Canada's new alliances are reshaping global power, one handshake at a time. Because while America is shouting about dominance, Canada is proving that real strength doesn't need volume, just vision. You're watching Cross-Border News, where silence speaks louder than power. It began quietly, before dawn in Kuala Lumpur, where the humid air clung to the tarmac and the red carpets glowed under airport lights. Cameras captured the moment Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped toward his plane, a calm smile hiding the weight of what had just happened. To most, this looked like the closing scene of another diplomatic trip, but to those paying attention, it was something far bigger. In that early Malaysian morning, the balance of power between Canada and the United States quietly began to change. The summit itself looked routine on paper, another ASEAN meeting, another handshake, another press release. Yet behind closed doors, Carney was redrawing Canada's trade map. He had spent 4 relentless days negotiating partnerships that would shift Canada's economic focus eastward, toward Asia's booming markets and away from Washington's political volatility. It wasn't rebellion, it was evolution. For decades, Canada's economy moved in rhythm with the US dollar. That morning, it began marching to a different beat. Carney's departure from Malaysia wasn't about geography, it was about ideology. While Trump's America screamed about tariffs, dominance, and punishment, Canada was quietly rewriting the definition of power: partnership, innovation, and purpose. And when Carney paused before boarding his aircraft, turned around and waved, it wasn't just courtesy. It was a symbolic farewell to an era when Canada's destiny was defined by someone else's decisions. Few in Washington realized what had just begun. But for millions watching around the world, that single wave carried a message louder than any speech. Canada was done being in anyone's shadow. The future wasn't being decided in DC anymore, it was being built quietly in Kuala Lumpur. When Mark Carney landed in Malaysia, it wasn't just another prime ministerial visit. It was a calculated entry into one of the fastest-growing regions on Earth. The ASEAN bloc, home to more than 650 million people, and a combined GDP already surpassing $4 trillion, has become the center of gravity for global trade. Within the next decade, that figure could double. Nations like Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia are rapidly industrializing, hungry for new markets, partners, and technology. And Carney saw what few Western leaders dared to acknowledge. The future of global commerce no longer runs solely through Washington or Brussels, it runs through Southeast Asia. In a private meeting away from the cameras, Carney sat down with Malaysia's Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim. Their conversation wasn't ceremonial. They discussed real collaboration, energy, digital trade, sustainable development, and clean technology. Out of that meeting came an agreement in principle to expand cooperation in LNG, renewable power, and nuclear innovation, sectors where Canada's expertise and Malaysia's ambition could merge. It was a deal that symbolized something larger: Canada's quiet departure from the US-centric economic orbit. Outside, reporters scrambled for soundbites. Was Canada realigning its global strategy? Was this trip a message to Washington? Carney didn't answer. He didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves. Canada had chosen its direction not out of anger but out of necessity. For decades, Canada's economic prosperity hinged on American approval. That era was fading fast. What Carney accomplished in those 4 days was subtle but revolutionary. He mapped a new chapter where Canada's partnerships weren't dictated by proximity, but by potential. Malaysia wasn't just a stop on the calendar, it was the cornerstone of a new global path. And as the summit ended, one truth became clear: the New World Order had quietly shifted eastward. Mark Carney didn't arrive in Malaysia to talk about dominance, he came to redefine it. For decades, Western power meant control, imposing rules, dictating alliances, and demanding loyalty. But Carney's tone was different. In every bilateral meeting, he spoke softly, but his words carried weight. His vision wasn't about leading by force, it was about leading through trust. That difference is now being called the Carney Doctrine, a philosophy built on partnership over power, diplomacy over drama, and stability over spectacle. At the summit's closing forum, Carney outlined a goal that caught even seasoned diplomats off guard. Canada would work to double its non-US exports within 10 years. It wasn't a threat, it was a declaration of independence wrapped in optimism. He spoke of resilience, not rivalry, of cooperation, not confrontation. And in that moment, Canada stopped looking like a supporting character in someone else's story and started writing its own. The doctrine's foundation lies in the idea that modern leadership doesn't come from volume, it comes from vision. While others shout about making nations great again, Carney is proving that greatness comes from purpose and patience. He's building green trade corridors, expanding clean-tech exports, and promoting climate-aligned financing, ideas that link morality with markets. It's a strategy that resonates far beyond Canada's borders, especially in regions exhausted by political gamesmanship. To his critics, Carney's calmness feels cautious. But history shows that in global diplomacy, caution often wins wars without fighting them. His doctrine has already begun reshaping how Canada engages with the world, transforming deals into partnerships and markets into shared missions. For Washington, this shift is unsettling. For Canada, it's liberating. Because for the first time in generations, Canadian foreign policy isn't echoing someone else's voice, it's speaking in its own. The world's economic compass is shifting, and Canada is adjusting faster than most. For decades, Western economies dictated the rhythm of global trade. But now the beat has changed. Asia's rise isn't a prediction, it's a reality unfolding in real time. ASEAN's collective GDP has already surpassed $4 trillion, and by 2035 it's projected to reach $8 trillion. Over 60% of the world's middle class will live in this region within the next decade. The demand for clean energy, digital infrastructure, and advanced technology is exploding. And Carney's trip to Malaysia wasn't symbolic, it was strategic positioning for what's coming next. While Washington debates tariffs and blames allies, Asia is quietly building. Japan, Korea, and Singapore have already moved toward regional integration. Even India is accelerating southward trade. What Carney saw and what Trump ignored is that the global marketplace is no longer defined by geography but by gravity. The center of gravity has moved east, and it's pulling smart nations with it. Canada, with its credibility, resources, and reputation for neutrality, fits perfectly into this new ecosystem. This isn't just economics, it's power realignment. The United States once used its market dominance as leverage, but now ASEAN and its partners have options. They can trade with nations that don't bully or weaponize tariffs. They can choose partnership over punishment. That's why Canada's timing couldn't be better. By deepening ties in Asia, Carney isn't abandoning the West, he's balancing it. He's ensuring that Canada's future isn't hostage to one market or one man's mood. The math speaks louder than any speech. Growth is happening east of the Pacific, and Carney is planting Canada right in the middle of it. The message is simple: where opportunity moves, leadership follows. When news broke that Mark Carney had finalized new trade agreements across Asia, Washington was blindsided. Reports from within the White House claimed that Donald Trump's advisors were caught off guard. No one had expected Canada to move this fast or this independently. The tone inside the Oval Office reportedly turned furious. One official described the mood as betrayal mixed with disbelief. Trump, who had long viewed Canada as an obedient economic partner, was suddenly confronted with a harsh truth. Ottawa no longer needed his approval. According to several diplomatic insiders, Trump demanded an immediate briefing. He wanted to know why Carney's name was all over Asian headlines, and why Canadian LNG and cleantech firms were signing billion-dollar memorandums in Kuala Lumpur while U.S. negotiators were still talking about tariffs. The answer was simple: Carney wasn't waiting for permission. He was building a future where Canada didn't have to fear U.S. retaliation every time it sought new partnerships. Within hours, American media outlets began spinning the story. Conservative networks framed Canada's move as reckless and disloyal, while economic analysts called it what it was: a strategic masterstroke. Behind the scenes, Washington's trade representatives scrambled to salvage influence in a region they had neglected for years. The irony was painful. Trump's tariffs meant to intimidate had only accelerated Canada's independence. Every aggressive tweet, every threat, every economic jab pushed Ottawa closer to Asia's open doors. Trump's fury revealed what Carney's composure concealed: that the United States was losing not just a trade partner but a narrative it once controlled. In that chaos, Canada stood calm. While Trump shouted, Carney smiled, because he knew something Washington was just beginning to realize. Quiet diplomacy wins longer wars than loud politics ever could. While Washington was still reeling, Carney was already moving on, not with noise but with strategy. His time in Malaysia was only one part of a wider plan. From Jakarta to Singapore, from Manila to Hanoi, Canada's trade envoys had been quietly laying the groundwork for something unprecedented. Transforming Canada into the world's first true bridge nation, linking North American innovation with Asian growth. It wasn't about picking sides, it was about building corridors. In Singapore, Carney met with financial leaders to discuss AI collaboration and fintech regulations. In Indonesia, he outlined Canada's role in supporting renewable projects through shared carbon credit markets. And in the Philippines, he floated a proposal that could redefine supply chains, using Canadian clean hydrogen to power Southeast Asia's ports. These weren't empty promises. They were blueprints for a post-American world economy, one defined by interdependence rather than intimidation. At home, even critics began to notice the brilliance of the approach. Canada was quietly becoming indispensable, not because it was the biggest, but because it was the most trusted. Carney's diplomacy wasn't designed to dominate but to connect. It allowed Canada to sit at both tables, Western and Eastern, without losing its integrity at either. For years, U.S. policy was built on exclusion. You're either with us or against us. Carney replaced that with inclusion. You can work with all of us. That shift made Canada a new kind of global player, one that could move between alliances without fear of reprisal. This wasn't just foreign policy, it was a revolution in how nations see themselves. The maple leaf, once a symbol of quiet politeness, was now becoming a global emblem of balance, proof that in a divided world neutrality isn't weakness. It's power. Throughout his trip, Carney's diplomacy carried a message far beyond trade deals and summit speeches. It was a masterclass in soft power. Every appearance, every word, even every gesture was deliberate. He wore the same small maple leaf pin on his lapel at every public event, not flashy, not boastful, but quietly assertive. That tiny emblem spoke volumes. Canada's strength doesn't come from muscle, it comes from meaning. When he addressed university students in Kuala Lumpur, Carney didn't talk about politics. He talked about ethics, innovation, and responsibility. Integrity, he said, is a form of infrastructure. That single line rippled across social media, reposted thousands of times by young Malaysians and Canadians alike. Because in an age when most leaders shout, Carney whispered and people listened. His approach contrasted everything the world had grown tired of. While Trump turned diplomacy into a stage show, Carney turned it into a conversation. His humility disarmed critics and inspired respect. Even leaders who disagreed with him admitted they trusted him. That's the essence of soft power, not forcing others to follow, but making them want to cooperate. At every forum, Carney made it clear that Canada wasn't chasing dominance, it was offering direction. Whether discussing green energy, digital transparency, or AI ethics, he projected an image of a nation that values partnership over profit, values over vanity. The maple leaf became a symbol not just of Canada, but of a new kind of leadership, intelligent, steady, and moral. And when cameras captured Carney's calm departure from Malaysia, his brief pause, his smile, his wave, it wasn't just a diplomatic goodbye. It was a signal to the world that Canada was stepping out of America's shadow and into its own light, armed not with weapons or threats, but with respect. When Carney's plane lifted off from Kuala Lumpur, the ripple effects reached far beyond Malaysia. In Asia, analysts called the trip a turning point for Western diplomacy. In Europe, newspapers described it as a Canadian awakening. Even within the US, commentators were forced to admit something rare, that Canada had managed to do what Washington hadn't: build alliances without burning bridges. The global reaction was swift and surprisingly unified. For the first time in years, Canada was being talked about not as America's polite neighbor, but as a leader in its own right. In Seoul, trade ministers praised Carney's balanced tone, calling Canada a stabilizing force in a volatile world. In Tokyo, editorial boards contrasted Carney's cooperation-based approach with Trump's tariff-heavy threats, noting how quickly Asian markets responded to Canada's credibility. Even Brussels weighed in, with one EU diplomat describing Carney's diplomacy as a template for post-superpower politics. The message was clear: the world was taking notice. Perhaps the most symbolic shift came from Washington's own allies. Countries that had long followed America's lead began quietly exploring deeper partnerships with Ottawa, not because of political loyalty, but because of trust. In a world full of bluster and unpredictability, Carney's Canada represented something refreshingly rare: calm consistency. Online, hashtags like #Carney Doctrine and #New Canada began trending, not just in Canada but across Asia and Europe. Commentators called it the rise of the middle power, where nations once considered small or secondary began shaping global policy through intelligence, not intimidation. And through it all, Carney said very little. He didn't gloat, didn't lecture, didn't boast. Because for him, respect isn't won with volume, it's earned through vision. The world had doubted Canada's influence for decades. Now that doubt was turning into admiration. As the engines of Carney's aircraft roared above the Malaysian horizon, one truth became impossible to ignore. Canada had crossed a line it could never uncross. This wasn't just another diplomatic tour. It was the rebirth of a nation's identity on the global stage. For decades, Canada's story was intertwined with America's shadow. Every policy, every trade deal, every international stance seemed to orbit around Washington. But this summit, and the calm, deliberate way Carney handled it, marked the end of that gravitational pull. Canada had stepped out from behind the curtain and the world was watching. The Malaysia Summit will be remembered as the moment Canada stopped reacting and started leading. It wasn't a rebellion, it was a realization that leadership doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, builds, and connects. While Trump turned foreign policy into spectacle, Carney turned it into strategy. He didn't demand loyalty, he earned respect. And in doing so, he restored something priceless: Canada's credibility. From Kuala Lumpur to Ottawa, from Singapore to Brussels, a quiet consensus is emerging. The next decade will not be defined by the loudest voice, but by the most trusted one. The red and white maple leaf has become a symbol of intelligence in diplomacy, of balance in chaos, and of courage without arrogance. So when Carney turned back before boarding his plane and offered that small wave, it wasn't just a gesture of courtesy. It was a signal, a farewell to dependency and a salute to a new era of direction. Canada's future no longer depends on proximity to power. It is power measured not in weapons or wealth, but in wisdom and will. And as always, this is Cross-Border News, where we show you the world not as it was, but as it's becoming.